Hello everyone, welcome to Politics Unspun with me, Jack McCluskey.
And me, Charlie Carter.
We're two PhD economics students discussing the hottest political debates.
Anything from the NHS and net zero to HS2 and educational reform, we have got you covered.
And with the new government in place, there's no shortage of policies to talk about. Forget the personalities, scandals, or question dodging. We're here to make objectivity great again.
And because we're right about everything all the time, we're putting our reputation and future career prospects on the line to share our thoughts and opinions on each one of these deliciously controversial topics.
Well, I'm always right.
You son of a bitch.
We're here to put the policy back into politics, all while having a laugh at ourselves in the meantime. We hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome to our first episode of Politics Unspun. Are you excited, Charlie?
I am very excited, Jack. How are you excited?
Very excited. Now, full disclosure to everyone, this is our second attempt at recording, so that's why it sounds so well polished. Charlie has promised to drink 4 different types of, is it cider, Charlie?
I didn't promise to drink all 4 different types.
Well, I just said that you promised.
I said that, well, I guess that means I have to do it now, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what we've got, do we have to worry about sponsorship stuff yet? I assume not.
I really don't think so.
So I got Northern Monk, which is how I try to live my life, you know. Northern Monk Faith, Hazy Pale Ale. I have Brewdog Wingman, Brewdog Lucky Break, and Brewdog Elvis Juice. So I'll give you a running commentary. I'll give you, what, scores out of 10?
Based on scores out of 10, yeah. Hoppiness, yeah.
Hoppiness and just general intellectual clarity that it grants me. So yeah, there we go. All right, I'll give you a run. I've almost finished the first one, which was the Northern Monk, and I'd say this is a solid 9 out of 10 for hoppiness and a solid 1 out of 10 for intellectual clarity. So we'll see how this goes.
Listen, that's fantastic, Charlie, but it has been like 10 seconds of the podcast and you're already through the first one. So if Charlie starts to slur his speech, I think everyone knows why.
Possible employers, I'm a good time.
Anyway, this week we're talking about higher education, and because again we're not polished, we did research slightly different topics, but I think that's actually added to it. I hope everyone enjoys. So Charlie, I'll let you start. What's interesting about this topic, and in fact, could you add some context?
Well, yeah, no, absolutely. So obviously, you and I, both PhD students, have both come through the whole undergrad system in the UK, in England more specifically, and where better to start our global podcast than close to home. Higher education in general has always been of great interest to me. It's fundamentally how our economy is based, and it really is important in terms of broader policy making. And I think it's been so undervalued in the current political landscape, and I think it'd be a really interesting place to start. Obviously, for the purpose of this podcast, we're going to be talking about the UK specifically, and we're going to be focusing mainly on the English system because this is the devolved matter. There's lots of different nuance and different systems within the UK, which makes it a bit more of a complicated issue, as we'll sort of see. But for the purpose of this podcast, to keep it interesting, to keep it simple, we're going to be talking mostly about the English system. So where do you want to kick off, Jack? Do you want to start talking about tuition fees? Yeah,
well, I think it's good to talk about how they work, because I'm not even sure that people who go to university in this country know how their fees work. I think it's so how complicated it was, and then never touched it again.
Absolutely.
So if I was to summarise it, I would say that in the UK and in England specifically, like you said, the tuition fees are capped at £9,250. Then you can get a maintenance loan for just living expenses up to 10.227k. That goes up to about 13 if you're in London, but that depends on your household income. So rich people can't apply for as large a maintenance loan as other people. That's different in Wales. In Wales, you have the same amount, but it's just the proportion that's a grant compared to loan that differs based on your income. So that's quite interesting. But when it comes back down to repaying your loans, and that's the really important part, the way it works is that you have to pay back 9% of anything you earn over this certain threshold. Now, for us, Charlie, we're lucky. The threshold for us is 27.29k. For people who are graduating, I believe it's past 2023 or enrolling in courses past that time, that threshold's been reduced down to 25k. So they're going to end up paying more. And our payments get cut off past anything that's left over is cut off past 30 years, whereas for them it's extended to 40 years. So that's a big difference in how much you'll end up paying. And for most people, because of the interest being around 7.8%, and that's linked to RPI, the Retail Price Index, which is historically a couple of percent above CPI inflation, which are a normal measure. Because of that rate of interest and people don't earn straight off the bat, most people won't pay back their loan during that 30 to 40 year period, which means that it essentially works out like a graduate tax, that you end up paying about 9% above, again, that threshold of, for most people now, will be 25k up until, you're 60 years old.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay. And there's obviously a lot of scope for policy in this arena. Adjusting tuition fees has become a little bit of a contentious issue since the increase in the tuition fee cap from about 3,000 to 9,000 under the coalition Lib Dem government in 2012. And this obviously looks like a very scary policy. We have a situation where, government is increasing the cost of education for students. But when you actually think about it, because, like Jack said, there's so few people actually paying off these tuition fees. If you're earning a relatively average salary coming out of university and then progress in a very particular way, you're not going to end up paying a lot of that money back. So tuition fees essentially are just a way of, one, increasing tuition and funding to universities or these institutions. And also it's a way of increasing the amount that high earning graduates pay on their earnings as opposed to low income, because they're high income are the only ones that are going to manage to pay it off. So although it's a relatively scary policy on the surface and has caused a lot of political tension, it's not actually that much of a damaging policy to students in and of themselves, right, Jack?
No, completely agree with that. As I said, it is, for most people, it's actually that percent of your income that you're paying back that's the bigger impact on your student debt and what you're paying.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I'm really interested in something you said in our first attempt, which is you had a long list of reasons why university education and universities in general are important. Would you mind going through those again? Because I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. So, obviously, when you're looking at an area to reform, one of the first major questions is, what is there to reform? Okay, what is the problem with the higher education system? And currently, I think I boiled it down to three main reasons. One, that it's not addressing the shortage of skills in the economy. Two, is that the students are coming out with very high levels of student debt that is impacting other factors in the economy. And three, that universities are massively underfunded. And the main reason for this essentially is because of the very high levels of inflation that we've seen recently. Costs are rising for universities. And meanwhile, the tuition fee cap of £9,250 is just stayed the same. So what's happening is that for a fixed revenue stream, costs are rising for universities, putting them under more financial pressure and making them look abroad towards international students to be able to fund that deficit, because international students pay more. And I think universities are massively important and a massively overlooked part of the higher education system. I think it's often very overlooked by government and policymakers. People often presume that the only things we've got to think about when we think about higher education is the student and the taxpayer. But realistically, we've also got to consider about the people who are actually providing the education. We've got to make sure they're happy. And universities are massively, massively important for two reasons. Firstly, they directly contribute to the economy in terms of their levels of employment. They employ people. They also help to work with small businesses. I think universities generally on average provide £11.6 billion of support to small businesses and non-profit in England. And overall, they contribute about £95 billion to the overall economy. And also, just from a research and development standpoint, people always think about universities as just being education institutions to educate young adults, but realistically, they serve a dual purpose of being hubs for research and innovation and research and development, having some of the highest qualified academics in the country. So that is really key, to be able to support these institutions that not only help to educate people, but also contribute to the research and development framework of the UK, which is so fundamental for future economic growth, future productivity, future real wages, which is something that governments have been very focused on recently. That is so important and shouldn't be overlooked.
Yeah, no, I think that's super important. And I think for a lot of people, they didn't study economics, didn't study growth theory like we do. And the one clear thing that comes out, I think you'll agree, is that long run economic growth comes from productivity growth. And a big part of that is research and development. And where else do they do it? Well, universities is where a lot of this research is done. There is some argument about how well that research transfers into private companies, the public domain.
But that's something we should talk about a little bit more, is how do we link these universities to working more in the public sector? And that's something that we really need reform for. to be able to link these very intelligent academics, people who work on research day in, day out. How do we connect them to more applicable uses in the private sector and the public sector and beyond? Because we really need these sort of ideas circulating our broader economy, not just staying within their closed circles of academia. And I think that's something the UK really struggles with. And one solution I think is going to be really important over the coming years is to rebalance the way in which we fund universities, to give governments policies that can influence the behavior of universities. And I'll give you an example. I think one might be the introduction of tuition grants or teaching grants, which used to be a thing and currently exists in Scotland as well. But these teaching grants would be given to universities, one for different subjects, which would essentially allow us to incentivize the provision of particular subjects. And we can go into more what that means and the specifics of that a little bit later if you want. But also you could allow these grants to be contingent on other things. So these grants could depend on how well the university is judged to be engaging the private sector and broader applicable uses. Give them grants if their research is more applicable as opposed to more abstract. And also starting to move funding to universities that have made efforts to improve the composition of the staff in their universities, incorporating more academic staff relative to non-administrative staff, which would really help the administrative burden that universities are facing currently. I think that would be a really interesting way of addressing those problems by giving those direct financial incentives.
So you're saying the grants would be different for different courses?
Yeah, so the grants would be different for different courses, giving higher grants to people to subjects that are part of the strategic sectors in the UK or part to courses that are currently part of the skills shortage. So those would be things like engineering, natural sciences, as well as teachers would be included part of the skills shortage. But we'd also want to focus attention to the strategic sectors like business and finance, the life sciences, and the cultural sector, which are really important for the UK economy.
Absolutely. So from a practical standpoint of that, see, my worry is that governments getting involved is that it becomes sort of an ideological stance. So how would, in your mind, how would it work to avoid that?
You worry away, Jack, but I've got Elvis juice at the moment. It's good. It's good. I think this is a little bit better than the other one. I give this like a 10 out of 10. Well, 9.5. 9.5.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. It's much better. So what was your question? No. So
just to be clear, you just finished a second one.
No. This is still full. I just had a first sip.
First sip, and you've already given it 10 out of 10. That is
taking it. Well, it'll only get better as it goes down, you know. I think the conversation flows better, but the policy analysis might jump on the cliff. No, so I think you raise a really interesting point, and it's a point you've got to combat when you're thinking about policy in general, is how do you maintain that it's not ideological, especially when you're passing information on to the next generation. But I think if you have a two-pronged approach in which you, year by year or every 5 years by 5 years, you essentially assess how valuable a course is, or at least how much it should be provided by universities based on two things. One, on how much that course is in demand in the private or public sector, so jobs coming out of university, so those would be shortages. And two, how much they contribute to the strategic sectors. And I think those, when you're looking at the statistics, are relatively unambiguous in what those should be. The support of finance, business and management degrees alongside life sciences and STEM subjects broadly are the courses that will be supported under that system. And then I think additional vocational training should be targeted towards more cultural subjects, which I think have been largely neglected by the previous government. But those are relatively unambiguous criteria to meet. And I don't think they're necessarily swayed by ideology.
Yeah, I wonder if we could link this almost to what we talked about, connecting research to the private sector and actual output. There are certain regional economies, I'm thinking about Birmingham, Somerset, that have sort of different economies to other areas.
Yeah.
I know that West of England has a lot of stuff related to the automotive sector. Maybe if we could get it so that they part fund some courses as well, in return for getting the courses to link a little bit better to the needs of those companies.
Well, absolutely. And I think, we are lucky enough to go to a university that does work very well with applied research. And I think the way they do it is just naturally by forging these links through networks and through funding. You can establish these links. I mean, you work for a company that works very much in the interdisciplinary space, works with a lot of different experts to create genuine applied applications. And I think that way is really effective at doing that. And like you said, I think looking at it by local basis. I think you have to be careful about localizing the educational space too much, just because students notoriously move between different areas of the country naturally. But yeah, definitely. I think broadly the higher education system should be very much focused on a need basis and shouldn't be focused as much on abstract academic thinking as much as it should be on applied academic thinking. And yeah, I think that's really important. And if we put the emphasis on that universities are centers of innovation and not just teaching hubs, then they might warrant the fund. They do warrant the funding that they're asking for. And just as a little statistic, just to highlight how underfunded UK universities are relative to other OECD countries. Other OECD countries on average pay about 1% of their GDP. Well, they pay about 2% of their GDP to higher education, and institutions receive about 1% of GDP on average from OECD countries. The UK pays more towards its higher education on average, but gives less to institutions. So it pays about 2.1% of GDP to higher education, but actually institutions within the UK only receive 0.5% of GDP.
Wait, so where's the rest go? What's that?
Essentially funding towards students.
I see.
Yeah. So essentially it's a much more student funding based system as opposed to other OECD countries. And I do think that needs to progressively change because, like I said, higher education institutions have been the middleman of policy over the last however many years for too long. And I do think that negatively hurts both educational outcomes and research outcomes, which is so fundamental in the supply side of the economy.
Yeah. It's what makes this topic interesting, isn't it? Because in the political spheres and the public debates, we think about it as you've got students on one side and you've got the taxpayer on the other. And we completely forget about this middleman, don't we? The higher education that are doing much more than just educating. They're research hubs, and that's important.
If you're talking about this from a political perspective, it's an interesting way of framing the tuition fee policy, which currently is up there with taxes for the things you cannot talk about. We saw that with the Lib Dems in 2015. But I think by reframing it and saying that increasing tuition fees isn't necessarily that much of a hindrance to students, like we said in the beginning, but it massively helps institutions, and it's an investment into innovation and productivity and economic growth, which are these buzzwords that we consistently see through politics. And I think if we reframe, there's definitely a way you can reframe this argument from a political perspective that doesn't cause political suicide. I think that from a political side, that's very, very interesting as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sticking on tuition fees before broadening it to some other parts that we know we want to talk about. The big question a lot of people will be asking is, should tuition fees be free? So should it be like Scotland? Should it be like a lot of Europe and Scandinavia?
Should we just go on 3, 2, 1? 3, 2, 1. No. You messed that up. No, I don't think tuition fees should be free. Obviously, you see this in Scotland, in the Nordic countries, and in Germany. And I think there's a few different reasons for this. I mean, just let's get the obvious one out of the way. It's incredibly expensive. And I think the opportunity cost of pursuing and paying for higher education, the amount of money that is used to pay for higher education, is better spent earlier on in children's formative years during primary and early secondary school education. And those are the policies that really, there were some studies by the LSE and by the, I believe it was the IFS, that was talking about how there are real formative years in a child's education that really directly influence their participation rate in university. And if we see, looking at the evidence, tuition fees have the very most marginal effects on participation rates. And I think if we're looking at it from that perspective and looking at it from a social mobility perspective, we've really got to be looking at where do we put that money? And that is a huge amount of money that could be spent on early formative years that would be much more beneficial for individuals. Personally, I believe that. I also believe it's very regressive. You have a situation where if you're completely financing college education, there is a situation in which the median, the average taxpayer is paying for Jeff Bezos's, Mark Zuckerberg's, Bill Gates' child to go to university. And I do think there's something a little bit wrong about that. And also, by absorbing all of the cost of someone's education at a higher level, you are essentially saying that it's only society who benefits, and you're not accounting for the fact the individuals themselves benefit from the degree themselves. And I do believe just fundamentally there should be an investment into yourself when you approach the higher education level, especially as there's other avenues that young adults can take. You don't just have to go to university now. You can go to apprenticeships, which are massively valuable, vocational training. You can go into the military. There are many other avenues apart from university. By making it free, we almost make our education for young adults very one-dimensional, which it really shouldn't be. There should be multiple avenues that young adults can take. That's my belief. What about you, Joe?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think in economics, we like to talk a lot about incentives. the very valuable thing about prices is that it connects your decisions and actions with their consequences and makes you evaluate, sort of do a cost benefit analysis in your head. By making you pay, it creates an investment scenario where you've got to wonder, is this course I'm doing, is the education I'm receiving, is the effect on my future earnings worth this cost? Just by making it free, it doesn't mean the cost disappears. It means someone else pays for it. You should be attached to that cost. But on the other side, there is an absolute, we've talked about this, absolute benefits to subsidizing this education, because if people do earn more money, they are going to be paying more taxes in the future. And I did analysis on this.
The average UK graduate graduates with £45,000 worth of debt, including maintenance loans. Now, let's assume that they earn £25,000 out the gate, then £35,000 in the second year, and then their income stabilises at around £40,000. They will end up paying back around a third of that debt. So that means they're receiving a subsidy of around 67%. Now, that sounds like a lot, but let's assume that graduates earn around £10,000 more than non-graduates. If we do that, then they're going to be paying, 20% of that as tax. So that means that the government's raising an extra £2,000 per year. Now, if we add that up, that actually comes out to exactly 67% of that original loan. Now, I haven't fudged the numbers at all. I haven't fiddled around the numbers to get that result. It's very interesting because the UK government assumes that graduates will earn £10,000 more. So it seems like it's a very well calibrated policy. It might be more luck than judgment, but from that very basic analysis, very naive analysis, it does seem like those figures add up. Now, obviously, we've got to start thinking, okay, maybe graduates earn 10 grand more, but they might have been smarter to start with, things like that. So it does get a little bit more complex, and obviously not everyone's going to be earning that amount. That's a very sort of average, sort of median amount. Some people earn more, some people earn less. But just from those average figures, it's quite interesting that it matches up, and maybe it is at the right level, or at least in the right ballpark.
I mean, it'd be interesting to see that obviously you need to incorporate some side of funding universities into that, because that seems to be the thing that would be missing from, I mean, it's fascinating, but that would be the thing that's missing is how do you optimize tuition fees when you include universities? I would wager that it's a little bit higher if you were to include university funding. And obviously the model could get relatively complex if you start including international tuition and things like that. But I mean, but it's interesting to see that from that sort of back of the envelope calculation, it's close, right? It's well calibrated.
Well, I think, I mean, obviously that's my analysis just on some basic numbers. I think that the key thing I'm saying really is that's the methodology that should be used to work out how much tuition fees should be, because it should be linked to how much extra the government's going to be receiving back in sort of tax revenue and other benefits we receive from people graduating from university. And it does seem like it comes out at that level.
Absolutely. So moving on now, so sort of talk a little bit about other systems in which other ways in which we can change higher education. We should probably look at the student loan, right, and how that can be adjusted. When you're thinking about changing, who pays for higher education, is it the government, is it university, is it the student? One way in which you can do that is by adjusting the student loan, right? And so how much you are paying back in your income, how long it takes before you are forgiven, or all the debt is written off, changing in the interest rate. Those things can also influence who's paying for it, right? Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. The thing that's in the political debate and sphere is the tuition fees, right? But actually, they have, at this level that they're at, they have relatively little impact on how much people pay back, because they're not going to pay them back anyway. So the thing that matters most is what the threshold is, what the percentage of your income above that threshold, and how long you pay it back for. And the recent changes, again, it was in like 2023 or something like that, they extended that period from 30 to 40 years. They reduced the threshold from 27.3 or so K down to 25. And these are essentially very sneaky ways of raising a lot more revenue for the government. And it doesn't really get that much political airtime.
Yeah, like you said, it's sort of a sneaky way of hiding the fact that you're redistributing the cost of education from government to students. And obviously there's a little bit of nuances to the effects of these policies. But broadly, who do you think should be paying for higher education? Obviously, you said that it can't be entirely free, but we also don't want students paying all of it. you reckon that tuition fees and the way the parameters of the student loan are set up now are relatively correct, right? That works out about right.
Yeah, it's an insanely complicated system. I mean, once you get into it, it actually becomes fairly simple. But for most people, it seems like, oh, why should I bother trying to work this out? It's so complex, right? But it actually seems, based on my calculations, it seems to work fairly well. It means that the amount that students are subsidised directly relates to how much they'll be giving back to our community, to public finances, which is brilliant. So that's great. And on top of that, the way we do it, so that there is a threshold that you don't have to pay anything back, is that it does create that sort of social security net that you don't see in America, particularly. I mean, that's the big one that we compare to, isn't it? But the strange thing is, I did look into America's system as an alternative. And, you know, the strange thing is that when you think of American student loans, you imagine them being absolutely astronomical. I don't know about you, but in my head, everyone's always talked about them being ridiculously expensive. You know, people talking about having college funds. You know, you'd never think about that in the UK. You've got, I've got to save up from when they're born so that they can afford university. That's strange, and we imagine it being, you know, awful over there. But I looked it up, and
I do imagine it to be awful over there. Yeah, it's not just in this.
That's twice, just for our listeners. That's twice that I've had to tell Charlie that you can't say that. But he went for it anyway. He went for it.
Yeah, well, I thought I could make
like a loose animal, this man. Right. Yeah. But
continue. Sorry.
The point is that actually, when you put it in comparison, UK graduates graduate with more student debt than Americans do, and this is even though like Harvard.
But to put that in context, I mean, on average, they're graduating more debt, which is absolutely crazy. Like I mean, I was always under the impression that, you know, medical students in the US came out with $500,000 student or dollars worth of student debt.
Yeah.
But to be clear, it's more subsidized here in the sense that there are more, you know, you have a forgiveness clause. There's a lot more of a safety net under our system than there is in the US, though you're looking at the actual debt.
That's the important thing. So their tuition fees are higher. So like Harvard, it's $55,000 a year, but you can get substantial grants based on your income. They consider a low income household to be on less than $75,000, which shows how much higher their incomes are.
I was about to say, I don't know what we are then, Jack.
Yeah, exactly. It's really scary when you put it like that. But yeah, they come out with, so we come out with about £45,000 worth of debt when we graduate. Whereas Americans come out with $38,783, so not even pounds. So that's less, right? And we think, oh wow, that's lower than I expected.
Yeah. But also for cost of living, if you account for cost of living as well, that's even lower.
Yeah.
So
it sounds crazy, but again, what we're linking this to is, but their loans are very different to ours. Number one, they have a very fragmented system. It's not a simple like for us in the UK. God, what are you going to say?
In America?
There it is.
No way.
Look, it's a big country. It's lots of states. They've all got their own situation. But fundamentally, in the UK, it's very, very simple. You've got one method that you get your loan, and that's how it works, right? It's one thing you've got to know. Even then, people find it complex, right? But in America, you've got all sorts of different loans you can receive. Federal loans. You can have subsidized ones, unsubsidized. I don't want to get into the detail of it, but the point is that in general, their loans work more like loans than ours do. Ours are income based. You pay 9% over a certain threshold, whereas over there, after 6 months after you graduated, you have to pay that loan back, and it doesn't matter what you earn, you're paying it back. And there's no sort of thresholds that after 40 years it's cut off. No, for most people you pay that loan off, whereas obviously here it's cut off. They do have loan forgiveness schemes. Notably, Biden had a big loan forgiveness scheme. I know that you say that's that might have been a mistake, clicking the wrong button on the Excel spreadsheet.
Possibly, yeah. The delete button. The blue button on his desk next to the red button. Yeah.
And it is believable that normally applies to people who are really struggling to pay back their loans. For the most people, it works like a normal loan. So although they come out with lower debt, their debt is actual debt. Ours is more like a graduate
exactly.
tax.
And there are some serious costs to doing that. By indebting students more, people may think that it's a little bit of a trivial issue. We've sort of made out almost to be, but it really isn't. If you're thinking about student debt in general and indebting students, what you're essentially saying is that through those interest payments, students are continually earning lower disposable incomes in their early years and right up until the 40-year mark. But the problem with that, one, is that it doesn't give graduates leeway and flexibility to move in the early stages of their career and be able to find the career that best suits them, because obviously they don't have the disposable income to do so, and there's risks associated with changing jobs. They're just not going to do it in the same way. So it slows down what in economics we call the job ladder, reduces the efficiency of the labor market, which can hurt competitiveness. That's number one. And secondly, from more of a human standpoint, during the cost of living crisis and the current issue we're seeing with house prices, by taking away in the UK at least about an average about £200 a month of someone's paycheck, you are seriously denting their ability to save for a deposit and seriously reducing their ability to sustain a good standard of living, which obviously is another thing you've got to consider when you're thinking about student loans, especially as a lot of people won't leave universities with astronomical salaries. I'd like to know the exact number of what the average is for leaving university, but I imagine it's in the 20,000 range. It's not like people are coming out on 40, 50,000 pound salaries. So I think that a little bit of leeway does need to be given to students from that perspective as well. So from the perspective, just rounding this off, really.
I'm very sorry for cutting Charlie off there. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. You can hear the rest in part 2. See you soon.